My name is Daniel Aldrich, and I'm the Dean's Professor of Resilience here in Boston, Massachusetts at Northeastern University. It's my pleasure to be here today with you. I want to talk about the idea of 30 minutes, one question, and 6 weeks, what I would call a life in pivots. Picture me a long time ago as a small child with a remote control in my hand. And I'm going to argue that at that moment when I chose a television show and then 2 other seemingly mundane moments in my life, those 3 moments, what I would call pivots, strongly influenced and determined the shape of my personal and professional lives that I've led over the last 50 years or so. So I'll talk today a little bit about this idea of chaos theory and the butterfly effect, which I'm sure you know already means that small changes, small perturbations in what we do or someone else does can have massive effects that we don't really see at the time, but it can build up over time. And I would say, so too in my own life, I envisioned for some time my life as a straight line, perhaps a planned Excel spreadsheet, right? Things coming down the pike. When in reality, many of those decisions that I made, which seemed small and unimportant, turned out to be really important. So I want to go back to that moment as a small child. When I was a young kid in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, my parents, both academics, wanted me to stay away from the TV. I only got 30 minutes of television a week. They wanted me to be outside and to read a lot of books. I did read a lot of books, but didn't really go outside so much. So I had to choose, how do I spend those 30 minutes? Would it be cartoons? Would it be rom-coms or other things? I chose a very strange show, a CNN documentary that would run Saturday night at 9:30 p.m. called This Week in Japan. And every week for 30 minutes, I'd be fascinated by the latest scientific, agricultural, political developments in Japan, memorizing names like Kyocera, Mitsubishi, Toyota, and really developing what I would call a obsession or fascination. That fascination stuck with me for several years. I kept watching that show every week, Saturday night, 9:30. And eventually, when I was a junior at the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics, I got a chance to make that a little more real. There was a contest, a national-wide contest by the Sony Corporation. They asked each student to describe what they were doing to get ready for a trip to Japan, what they would do in Japan. And I was so ready for this. I had, years of watching the show. I knew all about Japan, wrote, I think, a pretty good essay, and I ended up winning. So I was Mr. North Carolina, at least that month, for 1 month, in Yokosuka, Japan, in Tokyo, and Hakata, Toyota, Japan. So there for a full month, on their dime, Sony showed me Japan. I had a host family, a number of visits around the country, and I realized at the end of that trip, it would have been so much better if I'd only spoken Japanese. So at the end of that trip in Japan, in 1991, I told myself I would learn Japanese, which was a lot harder than it sounded in my ears. Some few years later, maybe 5 or 6 years later, after many hundreds of hours of memorizing kanji, the ideographs, of going to Japan, spending time with Japanese classes and tutors, I was able, in the end, to learn Japanese well enough to pass the professional proficiency exam. And then went on to spend many, many years in Japan. In fact, now, as a professor, rather than being taken to Japan as a student, I'm taking my own students to Japan with me. I have a 1-month program I take in Japan every summer. I bring students from Northeastern and other universities to Japan. We study sites of disaster and recovery. So to go back to that moment, what seemed to be a very small choice about a selection of a TV show was almost like a life decision at some level. I thought I was watching TV, but I was really setting up my future as someone who cares deeply about Japan and is still very much involved professionally in Japan. The second pivot I would call the question. I was at the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics for my junior and senior years in high school, and the very first day of school, I realized I had no idea how to do my own laundry. I was a very spoiled kid, thank you, Mom, for years of service. I had never done my own laundry, and I asked my roommate, who didn't know what he was doing, I asked people on my hall, third Brian, the male hall there, and I decided I would just take a risk, and I knocked on the door of the women's dorm, which is just on the hallway, third bell, and I literally knocked on the door. I yelled down, can anyone help me do my laundry? Several women decided that was a poor choice and let me know unequivocally, but one person at that hall decided that she would take mercy on a naive 16-year-old, and we went out to do laundry, and then we had dinner together, and then a few years later we got married. We've had 4 kids since then. We've traveled around the world. We moved 17 times and had a pretty exciting life, I think, as a married couple. So there was a moment as well. I had no idea what would come out of this process of asking for help from a stranger or from a random person in this case. and that friendship turned into marriage, and that marriage has become a partnership where I owe very much my wife so much of the work that I've been able to do. So I almost didn't ask. I thought I'd figured it out, and what would my life look like if I hadn't asked that question? So another pivot in my life. The last one I would call the 6 weeks. So now we're at the end of my graduate school career. My wife has finished her graduate school as well. We're looking for jobs, and I finally find a job in Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. And there we moved down in the summer of July of 2005 from Boston down to New Orleans. And we had 6 pretty good weeks there. We got a new car. We had a house. We filled it with stuff. We finally had a paycheck coming off of the $18,000 a year I was earning. For a family of 4 as a grad student, we finally had some more money to spend. At the end of those 6 weeks, unfortunately, something pretty dramatic happened. We noticed over the weekend of the last weekend of August that our neighbors were getting in their cars and their trucks, packing up their things, their dogs and their grandparents, and driving away. And they mentioned briefly to us as we asked what was going on, because we didn't really pay attention, that something called Hurricane Katrina was coming. It wasn't until late Saturday night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, our neighbor Kathy knocked on our door and said to us, "Why are you still here?" We were so clueless. We had no idea about the damaging winds and floodings that could come, and she encouraged us to leave. So we did. Very early Sunday morning, we packed our kids in the car, got and began driving west, because all roads, including I-10, only go west during a hurricane in New Orleans. Ended up in Houston, Texas, some 14 hours later, rather than a 4-hour trip like it is normally, because, of course, 1 million people from New Orleans also were evacuating from that major shock. And Sunday night came and passed. We're staying in the edge of an industrial park in a Days Inn in Texas, in Houston. We wake up the next morning expecting to go back, and we hear yells from the lobby of the hotel. We go downstairs, and it turns out there's no water in the streets. Either the hurricane has gone. The levees, the walls that surrounded that city, keeping out the water from Lake Pontchartrain and from the river, the Mississippi River, have collapsed. Trillions of gallons of water are pouring in on our house, and about 80% of the city is underwater within a few minutes, and would sit that way for several months. So my job at Tulane in 2005 never started. I never got to work on the campus that year. My children's schools never opened that year. We didn't do a lot of things we had planned on doing. But in the process of trying to think about what we're going to do next, right? We have no house. I have no job at the time. My kids have no school. I began to notice very closely what the recovery process looked like for us. I envisioned that the state or the market would save us, the state being FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or the market, insurance. I envisioned we'd get a big check in the mail. We'd go back to New Orleans with that big check and get a new house and a new car. And neither happened, actually. FEMA denied our multiple faxes that we sent them asking for help. Our insurance never activated. We weren't there long enough to do so. So we had neither the state nor the market to rely on. What really helped us in that process of recovery came from friends, friends of friends, networks, what we called social capital. I began to wonder, were our experiences as survivors in New Orleans similar to or different from those, let's say, of someone in India surviving the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami or the 1923 Tokyo earthquake? So I proposed a grant that semester. I ended up winning it, and we ended up going to Japan and India the next year. And rather than having a long Tulane-based career, my career is focused instead on disasters and shocks. Again, from those 6 weeks that we had no idea were coming. So here, destruction becomes observation. The observation becomes research questions. And now I have a scholarly identity as someone who does social capital and disasters. So Hurricane Katrina did take all of our material possessions, but at the same time, those 6 weeks of my life gave me a new perspective on what to study and what to learn about. So I'd go back to this overall perspective I have now by the butterfly effect. It's not just physics where there are things happening that we don't understand at the time. It's really our biographies, right? Our threads of our lives are drawn together in ways we don't understand. And I would say there were 3 things that I see in what happened to me. One was an openness. Even though I had no idea what was coming with that This Week in Japan special, or by knocking on the girls' dorm, or by being in New Orleans, I was open to the possibility. I really wanted to pursue what I could get out of those moments, rather than shutting down and insisting that my future would be as I had planned it. So I think those lessons from disasters, from a stranger's help, from a TV show, apply to a lot of us, right? When we're doing things that maybe we don't want to do, are we open to what we can get from them? Presence. I really tried to be present, even though some of those were really uncomfortable situations. Not having anything besides literally a small bag of toys, which was our leftovers from Hurricane Katrina, was quite uncomfortable. And in that process of trying to rebuild, I tried to understand what is it that we can look about in the long term. And finally, making meaning. And really try to understand what is it that we could get from this process, not just experiencing randomness, but integrating into what we become. So I'll challenge you there in the audience. All of us have had these moments of randomness, things happening we didn't expect. Maybe you can recognize them, maybe you can't. What were your 30 minutes or your question or your 6 weeks? What are the ways that a pivot has come into your life and you've adopted it or moved away from it? All of us, I think, have a chance to take these quiet moments and make them something more, and wish you much luck. Thanks so much.